Hello and welcome back to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American Single Malt Whiskey and related products. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. Welcome to everyone who's joining us live. It's good to have you here. Say hi to each other. Let us know what you'll be pouring to drink along with us tonight. Just to give you a preview, we have a Copperworks, a Blinking Owl, 2 Heritage Distillery, a 2 Bar Spirits, and a Santa Fe. So if you have any of those brands or you have these bottles, feel free to sip along with us. Otherwise, just let us know what you're going to be drinking along with us. So today, our special guest is Bill Christy, the founder of American Single Cask, which is one of the newest independent bottlers on the market. Their current portfolio includes 6 bottlings, 3 of which are American single malts, so they're right at home on this podcast. And at least one of the others is an interesting talking point adjacent to the discussion around American single malt. We also have a classic rye and a bourbon finished in a red wine cask. So we've got a lot of different types of things to talk about, a lot of ground to cover. We'll try to get to all of them in the 2 hours-ish that we have, but if we don't get to some of them, we'll at least try to get to the American single malts first, as long as that's okay with Bill. Sure. Bill, thanks for joining me here. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks very much for having me, Doug. I'm excited to have a few drams with you and talk about American Single Cask and talk through these whiskeys.
Well, great. I'm excited to get into them. So I feel like the Copperworks is as good a place as any to start.
Yeah. I've done a few tastings now, and the lineup I've found sort of works best just as they're numbered 1 through 6. Okay. That does leave the Santa Fe at the end, but I think the mesquite smoke is the most dominant in terms of your palate, and it's tough, probably toughest tasting past that with subsequent whiskeys. But if you want to do that third, we could do that third. The Copperworks is where I have always started.
Yeah, let's stick to the order, actually. And I think if we're running low on time, we'll maybe gloss over the 2 non-American single malts sure, as we go through. I think I mean, when I lined them up, I was like, okay, they're numbered 1 through 6. That's a logical way. And I was looking at them as I was doing my tasting yesterday. I was looking at them and going, is there another logical order that makes sense here? And I looked at the caskings and the profiles and gave them a sniff. And I said, no, that 1 through 6 is really the best way to go through these. My only concern is just time and the audience's attention span.
Yeah. So cool.
Yeah, but I think we'll try our best to get through the whole thing. In order. Yeah.
So we'll talk about this whiskey. The first cask number 1 is an American single malt from Copperworks Distilling in Seattle, Washington. Copperworks is right down on the waterfront. It's sort of where every tourist wants to be. It's a perfect location for them. And on my visit there, we tasted a bunch of whiskeys, and what he was presenting me with was like 3- and 4-year-old single malts that were in new American oak, had been matured in new American oak. And I just felt like they wanted more time. There was something that was a little edge to it that I didn't quite like. And I asked him if they had anything that was older, and he said, well, yeah, we've got some older ones that are in refill casks, refill American single malt casks. And that's what this is. He sent me a bunch of samples, and this was one of them. It is the lightest colored of any of the whiskeys by a long shot, because it's a refill cask. So it's already been used once, and then they refilled it. It's a 6-year-old. It is 62.45%. So all of these, that's the one word I give at the beginning of tastings. You're familiar with cask strength whiskeys, but everything that American Single Cask bottles is going to be cask strength, natural color or no color added, as the TTB made me say, and non-chill filtered. So awesome. They are all pretty stout. Almost all American whiskeys, as you know, as they mature in the US, they go up in ABV rather than down. There are a few exceptions in the Pacific Northwest, but most of them go up pretty quickly. So these are all, with the exception of one, they are all over 60% alcohol. So they are made to, unless you really like it that strong, they are made and they excel, I think, with a little bit of water. But I always to taste it, give it a taste for.
I came prepared.
Me too. I've got my glass of water and dropper handy, as always. But I always like to take a gentle, a cautious whiff of the whiskey, put a cautious nose of the whiskey, and a little tiny sip, and let it sit in my mouth for a little bit. But so the other thing about Copperworks, like a lot of the distilleries in the Northwest, they were all beer guys originally, craft beer guys who came to distilling from craft beer. And I don't know if it's my imagination, but that quality, there's an ale quality, an ale taste that seems to permeate a lot of those distilleries. It's true of Westland and Westward and Copperworks and some others. Copperworks doesn't do its own malting. It actually sources out the malting and brewing to different people. The malting is done at a malting house. The brewing is done by a craft brewer, and the distilled product shows up in a tanker truck, and then they distill it and fill their casks in-house there. Yeah, this I get right away. It's a pretty light whiskey. I get things like white raspberries, lighter berries. The interesting thing was at the first tasting I ever did in LA a couple of months ago, a gal shot her hand straight up and she said, "I get spearmint on the finish, and I've never gotten spearmint from a whiskey before." Huh. And I had a gander at it, and it's there, just barely, just a hint of it. But it's a nice light whiskey. It's a good place to start in this lineup. And the finish, I think, you get all these berries on the nose, like especially raspberries and some cranberry. And then towards the finish, it goes really into sort of like a creme brulee with just a touch of amaretto.
I wonder if I was reading your tasting note. I did get a vanilla custard on the finish, and sort of that combined with that sort of caramelized sugar and creme brulee makes sense. I love creme brulee as a dessert. It's sort of one of my family's specialties of making desserts. And we like doing it in the shallow pans because we like to have more crunchy sugar topping and not as much of the eggy pudding. Because maybe we're not very good at making the custard, so it always ends up tasting eggy.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I love that the crunchy caramelized sugar after they take the torch to it and to finish it off. Yep.
Welcome Peter White in the chat. Says some ryes can be very minty. I agree. I get mint flavors from rye components often.
Oh, for sure. Almost every rye I get mint from, and it's definitely in this one that we'll get to.
The lady was saying that she doesn't get spearmint before.
She said from this Copperworks, she said she shot up her hand and said, "I get spearmint in the finish. I definitely get spearmint," and I think there's just a hint of it at the tail end, but it's a nice, light, complex whiskey.
Yeah. So the coolest tasting note that I got that might be unique from your tasting notes. So for me, Copperworks is usually really bright and citrusy.
Yes. Yep.
I would say Copperworks has like three main profiles if you don't count the finished whiskey. So one, it's like this bright and citrusy thing. They've got another style. They've got some peated whiskey, the Pacific Northwest peat. That's kind of its own thing. And then they also sometimes have this darker style of whiskey where it's that sort of bright citrusy level is sort of taken down, and it's got a meatier body to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is more that like the bright and fruity and citrusy. Um, and this one gives me something a little different than I get from other Copperworks. I get pomelo from it.
Hmm.
It's a very particular kind of citrus.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think that's the one thing I had forgotten is yeah, you get a big hit of also orange right off the nose and orange zest.
Mhm.
And maybe it morphs a bit into towards lemon with water, but it starts off with a lot of citrus, a lot of orange, like you said. So this is the closest to, I think it's sort of the closest to a Scotch, which is how I came to American whiskeys and how a good part of my thought process coming into American Single Cask was. Um, uh, Coming from Scotch, what I love most, God, if you could see my bar, you'd see plenty of them, but independent bottlers of Scotch whiskey. A lot of these companies have been around since the 1800s, names like Berry Brothers and Rudd, Signatory, Cadenheads. Some of them have been around a long time, and now there are just loads of them. They started out blending initially, and then when they started to realize that single malt was gaining in popularity, they started just bottling their extent. They had warehouses full of barrels from and casks from all different distilleries, and they started bottling them as just single casks. So they would number them. You know, here's a Tamdu, and it would be numbered bottles number 1 through 437, and once they're gone, they just bottle the next and rinse and repeat. That sort of meant two things for me. Well, that what really gelled, the light bulb moment, was realizing there was a boom in American craft distilling, and not just that, but that some of them, once they were getting a bit of age, were really turning out to be fantastic. And whereas before they'd been a bit rough, but showing promise. But when I realized what was happening, that light bulb, those two things sort of came together for me. And I thought somebody needs to be doing, somebody needs to be independent bottling American craft whiskey. This started gelling about 7 years ago, maybe 8, as an idea. And I started talking to people about it, and people were encouraging and all. So as I formed that, what I thought I wanted to take from independent bottlers of Scotch was two things. One, the form that they bottle in, which is on the front of my label. You can see here's the bottle of Copperworks. And it sort of ended up, when we were designing the label, where am I going? There. It says, always cask strength, no color added, never chill filtered. And we were just looking, we wanted all the information on there. And my graphic designer, we have this space, and he said, well, let me just try this, and put it there. And I was like, it just looked perfect. And I've always felt that was those three things made up the best way to bottle whiskey. The other thing was complete transparency. That's why I wanted this big flat bottle with a great big label that I could fit all the information on, that every bit of information that any whiskey geek could possibly want about, going backwards and trying to get myself straight here. But getting the date it was distilled, the age, the distillery that it came from, the date it was bottled, the bottle number, the ABV, all of that information there. And it was also the idea of doing that. It was sort of bucking a trend in American whiskey where people are doing what's called sourcing and bottling whiskey from MGP a lot, and just having the name of, it'll even say that they're a distillery on the label. And you can only find somewhere on the back label at the very bottom, in the very smallest print, it'll say distilled in Indiana. So I really wanted to have a brand that was completely transparent, that everything is up front. It says American Single Cask at the top, but immediately below that, it tells you that it was distilled at Copperworks Distilling in Seattle.
Yeah, I absolutely love the transparency on these labels, and so I'm gonna actually ask a couple of questions from the chat real quick, just so we don't lose them, and then I have a couple
Sure.
of questions or a couple of observations and a little bit of fanboying to
Fire
do
away. Is there a way for
myself.
me to see the chat, or can
Oh
we?
yeah, so on the right side of your interface, there's a comments tab, so you should be able to see. I
I'm not.
believe you should be able to see the live chat
Should I
coming into
click on
StreamYard.
chat with everyone in the studio? No. It says private
Oh,
chat
are you on
comments.
an iPad?
No, I'm on a laptop.
Oh, okay. So you're in the website, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I
StreamYard.
think I think this should work. So on the side, I have like comments, banners, brand. This is like the creator interface, I guess. We have a private chat,
Comment.
but
Got
there's
it.
also the
Comment.
comments.
There
Yeah.
we go. All right.
Yep.
Now I'm
Okay.
part of.
Cool. Figured it out.
Now I'm in the
Uh,
party.
yeah. So I'm just gonna highlight some of these comments real quick. So first of all, Peter White, thanks for being in the chat. I'm sure it looks like there's other people watching that we haven't heard from anybody yet. So Peter White's having a Stranahans. And I feel like we could ask Bill if he's planning on bottling any Stranahans in the future, if he's okay with
I
revealing his future plans.
I don't know that Stranahan's would be open to it. They are
Okay.
certainly a distillery that I'd be happy to approach sometime down the line. I'm starting on the West Coast and going to be working my way east.
Hmm.
We can talk a bit more about that later, but that's really sort of the round after next. I'm wanting
Okay.
to get to some new distilleries, chasing smoked whiskeys in particular.
Cool. I am
Yeah.
a big fan of those. I like the sound of all of that.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that's kind of a nice segue. If you don't mind, Bill, I like to call out other brands if they come up in the chat. Peter
Yep.
observed that Lost Lantern also does a couple of American single malts. Yep. We have a great interview on this channel with Lost Lantern, so you could check that out. We talked about a lot of their American single malts during that, maybe even exclusively American single malts during that.
Yeah.
They do have
Yeah.
a lot. They're all
Yep.
quite good. And I guess in terms of you're working from the West, to some extent, they're also working from the East because they're based in Vermont. And they've been all over, but they've done a lot more on kind of the East and the Midwest recently. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
American distilleries, there's a whole lot of them, over 2,000, maybe getting close to 3,000. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of craft distilleries that are really worth
Yeah.
highlighting.
Yeah.
And IBs are the way to go, Peter. It's a great way to get access to things that aren't in your area if you've got a brand that highlights the good ones and distributes to you.
For
As
certain.
are they available in Alberta, Canada? Is a question for Bill.
Boy, I am so far just in the U.S. Well, I'm in Scotland also. I got a pallet of my whiskey to Scotch whiskey auctions in Glasgow. They bottled casks number 1 and 2 last month. This month are 3 and 4. Next month will be 5 and 6. They ship worldwide, although I know Canada's regulations and everything make it pretty tough. But it's a possibility. It might be a possibility that you could buy at Scotch whiskey auctions and have them shipped there. I don't know if retailers in the U.S. can ship to Canada or not. That's a good question. I haven't had anyone reach out from Canada before, but but you should probably. I would bet the best route would be looking at ScotchWhiskeyAuctions.com and picking up a bottle there. Some are with the bottles number 1 are live auction, and everything else is fixed price, buy it now. So you can be guaranteed to get your bottle if you just click on the buy it now button. Well, you got to set up an account and everything first, but that might be your easiest route from Canada. Yeah. Oh, there's my
All right,
buddy.
a little more roll call. Thank you for that answer. I know that it's complex when you've only got 200, 300 bottles of each release. Where do you get those? Where do you allocate those? Right, because they are all single casks, so they're not.
Yeah. Yep. So I sent a whole pallet, 360 bottles to Glasgow. Also sent a pallet to Sealbox, and they have sold out. And
Yes.
I'm trying to get them to reorder.
Okay.
And they say that they are so busy leading up to the holidays that they can't take any new orders. They said to check back in mid-November. So I'm going to hit them up pretty quickly here and see if I can't get them to reorder and have another outlet for before the holidays here. The other one that has plenty of stock is K&L Wines in California. They're a really good chain, smaller chain that's in the Bay Area and LA, and they've been great for me. And there's plenty of stock there.
Yeah, we really like K&L, although I think you pretty much have to be in California to actually get the bottles.
Yeah, I've seen them saying that they can ship spirits out of state now, but I think it involves some hoop jumping, going to a storage facility that they have, independent storage facility, and then they take possession of it, and then they can ship it onward. Not sure of the status of them being able to ship out of state. But as for the buying direct, I am currently breaking up with the supplier I had, the company that was taking and fulfilling orders from my website directly, and going and moving to another company. So that should be done before the end of the month, and so that should be live again in plenty of time for the holidays.
All right. Before I go on to more questions from the chat and more of my own questions, we're 20 minutes in, so I think now's probably a good time for us to get on to the next.
Let's move on. Yeah. All right. So whiskey number 2 is cask number 2, I should say, is from Blinking Owl Distillery in Santa Ana, California, which is now a closed distillery. They had a business model that was not able to weather COVID and the after effects of the pandemic. But I was in touch with them, and I visited the distillery when they were still up and running. It was perfectly beautiful distillery, and they had a restaurant attached to it and everything. I first met the distillers at a whiskey show in LA several years before, when they were just starting the distillery and only had gin at the whiskey show. But had a nice chat with them and was telling them about my business plans, and said that I might look them up down the road. Well, I did, and they sent me samples, and this one really was a standout for me. It's matured in new oak. It's a 5-year-old American single malt, matured in new oak that is toasted, not charred, which is just crazy in the amount of wood spice that treatment brings into it. There's loads of baking spice coming off this whiskey, and it is just super, super flavorful. So yeah, this is just tons of baking spice, and then it also has this really nice chocolate and deep cherry note that it descends into. Sort of like, what are those candies called? Cherry cordials?
Yeah.
Cherry cordial with dark chocolate.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I almost wrote a full-on review of this one last night when I was tasting it. It just completely captured my attention.
Yeah.
The first impression I had of this one was that it actually reminds me a lot on the nose of Wild Turkey Rare Breed, because it has that deep cherry and that cocoa and the toffee.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually went and grabbed my bottle of Russell's, which is the closest Wild Turkey I could find, because I didn't want to go too far from my desk searching. I know where the Rare Breed is, but I would have had to move glasses. So and just sort of confirmed that, because sometimes my palate, convinces me that something tastes like something else, and then I actually put them side by side and they're nothing alike. I think it was a good side by side, and this one has a little bit less of the sort of like the really bright sort of bourbony character.
Yeah.
But the biggest difference that I got was that this one has like a lot of like a heavy nutty profile on the palate.
Yeah.
It's got like lots of pecan, and it's really bitter, but not in a tannic way. It's like nut skin bitter.
Yeah.
Right. Which I thought was really, really cool. I love bitter things. I'm all about black coffee, and I mean whiskey is an inherently bitter thing too. But we're all kind of used to that, and I just like that bitterness in the profile. And compared to the Russells, this is somehow more bitter and also more sweet at the same time.
Yeah, it's a bit of a journey. I think there's on the nose you get all this spice, baking spice, nutmeg, cinnamon, that sort of thing. And then the palate is, I'd agree with you, it's bitter, and there's some cocoa there. And then it's really, that passes quickly in the development. And then onto the finish, it hits this, the wood spice is still there, but then it hits this note of cherry cordials, this deep, rich cherry, and also a dark chocolate. So that bitterness I like in the mid palate, and then the finish is where it sweetens up, and it's got a really, really nice long finish. I wanted to say one thing about this whiskey. Complete transparency. There are 2 mistakes on the labels. This one, okay. This is my handwriting, and it says 63.3%. And this is actually 66.3%. That is my handwriting. I was writing on the labels. There was another gal at the bottling company who had written some to begin with, and I don't know how I got the number wrong, but I just went on writing 63.3% through all of my bottles. So that's one mistake, just for complete transparency. The other thing I wanted to address, you had brought up Lost Lantern before, and yeah, I think they're doing fantastic work and very similar. I was still in the developmental stages with my business when they came out, like a couple years ahead of me, and I was like, oh God, if you don't go quickly enough, somebody else has the same idea. But there's plenty, like you said, there are over 2,000 craft distilleries in the US, so there's plenty of room, and there's no need for competition of any sort. They're on the other side of the country. I'm in Las Vegas. They're in Vermont, as you say, and I own a couple bottles of theirs, and yeah, I think they're doing fantastic work. They're
all around me.
Yeah, I bet. And they're doing.
There's one there. There's one there.
Yeah. They're doing really good stuff. They are doing taking a little bit different angle on things. They're bottling something single cask, but they're also doing blending. They've got an American blended malt, vatted malt, and they're doing single distillery blends too. And I think I'm just going to stick with what the name says, American Single Cask. So that's a small difference, but there's a lot of overlap in what we're doing, and I think a lot of similarities in our visions.
All right, before we add water, actually, I'm going to add water now and kind of let it settle in.
All right.
I'll ask a couple more questions from the chat and do some roll call.
Go on. So I saw my buddy Ali he's in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Hey, Ali.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Hey, Ali Milton. Thank you for joining the show.
Yeah. Good. Back in full with the dram. Good. All right, go on.
Let's
have it.
So just a little bit more roll call while we're doing that. So Sugar Kitty says K&L won't ship outside of the US. Says they really can't. It's kind of a concierge service. You have to send special paperwork. You have to pay sales and other taxes on it. Not great for a single bottle.
Yeah. Yep. So that's tough. I will hopefully, as I grow, be able to ship to Canada or have better options. But right now, like I said, probably the best is through Scotch whiskey auctions. And you should pounce on that quickly, because it'll be this month's auction and then next month's auction. And then I think we're probably done there, unless we've got some left over. But
Also, on the note of different independent bottlers and there being room for everybody to play in this pool, there are obviously the big players that, like, everybody's gonna, there's certain at least in the realm of American single malts that this podcast covers.
yeah, yep.
We know that there's 250 plus distilleries making American single malt, and probably some we don't know about. And we still, I think, in the space of independent bottling, in terms of me and other podcasts talking to makers of American single malt, we tend to go back to the same 10 to 20 distilleries as sort of a home base.
Yeah.
The people who have a certain amount of scale and a certain amount of thought leadership in the category, not to exclude anyone else who has definitely been a big part of making the category what it is. So naturally, between American Single Cask and Lost Lantern and Single Cask Nation, which, as long as we're naming independent bottlers, shout out to Single Cask Nation. I have their Copperworks here. I compared.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. They are primarily a bottler of Scotch whiskey, but they do a fair sprinkling of American craft whiskey. There are other independent bottlers of Scotch who are reaching across the pond and picking up single casks from the US too.
Yep, I believe SMWS did a Westland.
Yeah, SMWS has done a few. They've done Westland, they've done Rocktown, they've done a few others. And there are others too. That Boutique Whiskey Company, I don't know if you're familiar with that bottler. They have done some, and there's one or two others, I think, who have done the odd bit, but it's sort of dabbling for them. They're primarily, all those people are primarily doing Scotch. The only full-time independent bottlers of American craft whiskey that I know of are me and Lost Lantern, who are doing it, I guess, in the style of independent bottlers of Scotch whiskey, with that sort of complete transparency. There
are other blenders, Barrel, for example, which doesn't have complete transparency.
Yeah,
and there's a few notable blends as well. There's the Good Deeds blend. You can see the Good Deeds bottle behind me right there.
Yep.
Which is the Step Up Foundation's blend of 10 different American single malt whiskeys.
Right.
Anyone else?
Nobody's doing
besides
single
Lost Lantern,
and certainly no one's doing complete transparency like American Single Cask and Lost Lantern are. Barrel, it just says, that it's barrel and it's cask number, blah, blah, blah. And they'll tell you what sort of finish it had or what sort of barrel it was from and how old it is, maybe, but they won't ever tell you who distilled it or where it was distilled or where it was matured or any of that.
Yep, you can guess because they name Indiana and Tennessee and Kentucky regularly on the back label as required. Yeah. That's as close as you're going to get.
Yeah, that's required by the TTB. So that's what you'll get, even with people who are completely sourcing and not giving you a clue. The very bottom of their back label or something, the very smallest font, it'll say distilled in Indiana, because the TTB requires you to say what state it was distilled in.
Yep. Before this comment gets too stale, Rangers Respite, my co-host who couldn't join us tonight, says, I look forward to seeing your products with the same regularity. And I think the same regularity was probably referring to Lost Lantern. But I'm not entirely sure now. Yeah. That was 5 minutes ago.
So we can talk
Ali says, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Ali says, I'm at work, so sadly not joining in with the drams. Have an extra one for me. I think we can do that.
Yeah, that won't be a problem. He's a Sparky, an electrician. He worked offshore oil rigs for a long time when off the coast of Scotland and in the North Sea. But now I think he's onshore at refining facilities working. Yeah, he's a great friend.
All right, so let's see. Was there any? We were talking about smoke whiskeys in your next rounds coming up earlier, so we could wait to address the question of smoky whiskey until later. I think I will. So I'll try to remember that question. Phil, feel free to ask it again if I forget.
Yeah.
Where does Doc Swinson's fall in there?
I would bet.
Funny enough, I have a Doc Swinson's glass.
Oh, nice.
And I've got one of these samples in here right now.
I'm not
Sorry.
terribly familiar with the brand, but I would be willing to bet that there is no such thing as a Doc Swinson's distillery. I think they're a brand who is sourcing. That would be my best guess. You would know more, Doug, I'm sure.
This glass is from 2.5 years ago. So as far as I recall, and I haven't spent a lot of time looking at that brand, but as far as I recall, they were sourcing at the time, and I don't know since then.
Yeah. I'd imagine.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining in the chat. Really happy to have you here, and thanks for sharing your dreams with us as well. So as long as we're talking about Blinking Owl,
Yes.
So as you mentioned, this business plan has been going for a while, but I feel like I have to ask for your sort of freshman outing as an independent bottler. You've got a ghost distillery on the docket, which is kind of an impressive feat. How did you pull it off?
It was not intentional. I had no idea when I went to visit them. Like I said, I met them at a whiskey show in LA years before, when they had just started distilling, and they were at a whiskey show with gin was all they had, because they didn't have any whiskey that had matured long enough, and they were doing it straight and not sourcing anything to bottle. They just wanted to bottle their own stuff. So they had gin, and they had a barrel rested gin. And I'm not a big gin guy, but I like the barrel rested gin. So that's how I became aware of them to begin with. And when I was making my first trips, I went to the Pacific Northwest, went to Seattle, Portland, Spokane, and then I went to the desert Southwest, distilleries all over Arizona and New Mexico. And then I went to Southern California and hit distilleries in between LA and San Diego. So I made sure Blinking Owl was on my radar, and I went and set up a visit with them, and met with the owner and the distiller, and really loved the whiskey that I tried there, and got home and had him send me samples, which is sort of how I am doing things. So that's a good topic to discuss at this point, I guess, is I'm visiting distilleries, taste what they have to offer, and decide what I'm most interested in, and then get them to send me multiple cask samples of those types of whiskey at home, sit down in my living room, put my dogs away, and try to be completely undistracted. I was going to have one of my some of my chicken scratch notes here, but I take 8.5 by 11 papers and set them down, mostly 2 if I'm doing 4 or more whiskeys, and write headings for color, nose, taste, and finish, and write a bunch of notes there, and then assign values to each of those qualities in the whiskeys, add water, and repeat with modifying the numbers for if things improve or stay the same, or in very rare cases get worse with the addition of water. Total those up, and that almost always gives me the winner. I go back and revisit and make sure, but it's surprising how I just started doing that. Well, I have a whole notebook of whiskeys that I'd done tasting notes on before, but I'd never done the ratings like that, and just started doing it as a way to really zoom in and hyper focus on all of the qualities of the whiskey, and it's worked out really well for me. So that almost always gives me the winner, the cask that I am most interested in, the most flavorful, the most complex and interesting. I never want to bottle what my friend Ben calls whiskey flavored whiskey. I always want to be interested and engaged and fascinated by what's in the glass, as well as to find it enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm with you. As a reviewer, I put a lot of value personally in terms of my subjective rating of a whiskey on complexity, because
Yeah.
if I taste a whiskey and I feel like I've gotten everything it's going to give me. I'm very unlikely to come back to that whiskey.
Yeah.
And then I end up with a whole bottle sitting there for years, barely touched again, unless there's something that I feel it's worth comparing to, or there's a friend I want to introduce to a certain flavor profile or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely with you there. Complexity means a lot to me.
Yeah.
And I have to say this whole lineup, not to bury the lead, this whole lineup definitely delivered in complexity.
Cool. Thank
And
you.
it even made me want to go visit some other things that I usually only visit because they're interesting, as opposed to, there's that other thing too. Sometimes things are complex and interesting and it's not something you want to reach for a lot.
Yeah.
Because it's also like, unless you're in a mood to think about it, it's not something that you enjoy drinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure you know what I mean. And I'm
Yeah.
not going to name names because that sounds like a negative thing. So
No, for sure. I've had really expensive bottles of scotch that I bought untried, like a 25-year-old Mortlock that I kept trying it. I had friends try it and I was like, look, I'm not getting anything from this. Are you? And they're like, no, you're right. And it just ended up getting handed over the backyard fence to the college students next door. And they're like, 20-year-old scotch.
yeah, there's always someone who's going to appreciate it more than you. That's the great thing.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, before I completely drain this glass, a couple of things. You can't really see it in my glass anymore, but look at the color on this whiskey. So this is the Blinking Owl. We were talking about color a moment ago. And the sample bottle is maybe a little deceptive, but that's kind of what it looks like through the corner of a Glencairn, and it's a pretty dark colored whiskey, and it's not the darkest. These are from this point on, they're all pretty close to that same sort of dark brick mahogany color, but they get darker. So
yeah.
And there's no color added, non-chill filtered cask strength. So
they're all variants of really dark color, except for the Copperworks is the only one that's really light, and that's because it's a refill cask. But
I'm getting something in here that is like late in the finish, a really strong impression of some kind of a dried cooking herb. It might be sage or thyme or something along those lines. I don't think it might even be bay leaf, actually. Something along those lines, which I think is really cool. And it kind of blends in with that nutty, dry, sort of bitter profile.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. When you get like a butternut squash ravioli, and chefs will often put fried sage leaves on top. I love the taste of those, and that's a bit of it. I think I've just sort of recently discovered the next whiskey, this chocolate malted barley, surprisingly has even more of that, I think.
I agree, and I actually called it out in my tasting notes on that one.
Really? Yeah. All right, so we get on to that one and try to make that one a little shorter, so we have more time for the single malts.
Maybe we'll try to fit the next two in like about a half an hour or so, and do a little bit of conversation along the way. This one, though, I think is worth more discussion. So my preamble on this one, I had to look up. Out of all of your labels, if you have the bottle to hold up, go ahead.
Yep. This is so just to say, I'm calling this chocolate malted barley whiskey. The TTB would not let me call it chocolate malted barley whiskey. They would not let me call it barley whiskey because there's no such category. Right. So I was going back and forth and going a bit crazy trying to get this label approved. And finally I got a TTB agent on the phone, and I said, I finally just asked her, well, what can I call this? And she said, you can call it whiskey. and so I thought about it, and finally that's what I ended up doing, was just putting whiskey in big print here, and then a vertical line, and next to it it says the mash bill, which is 10% chocolate malt, 90% unmalted barley. The chocolate malted barley, for those of you who don't know, is primarily used in brewing dark beers. It's primarily used for stouts and porters and dark beers like that. It does very seldom find its way in very small doses into some whiskey mash bills. And what chocolate malted barley is, it's not flavored. It's not got chocolate thrown into it. It is just heavily roasted malted barley that brings out this incredible chocolatey flavor. When I was a kid, I would get a chocolate milkshake, and my dad would get a chocolate malted. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. And they would, all that was they would take a teaspoon of chocolate malted barley and throw it into the chocolate milkshake and blend it together. And it would give it that extra cocoa-y pow. So I guess this is a good point to talk about heritage quickly, and that will get me to this whiskey. I didn't want to go to Heritage Distillery initially. I had looked at their website, oddly enough, and they've become a fantastic partner. Probably the best partner I've gotten. I've bought multiple barrels from them now. There will be more coming down the road. But I'd looked at their website, as I did all my research before I took these trips, and figured out what distilleries I wanted to go to. They had made their name selling flavored whiskeys and vodkas. Their biggest product was called brown sugar bourbon. They ended up having to sell that off. But that was what I was seeing from their website. They did have a bottling of straight bourbon too that I think they called Elk Rider. And so my friend Alan, who lives in Tacoma, Washington, and I was going to visit and stay with him, and he was going to go around to the distilleries with me. He's my financier, actually, and a very dear friend. He said to me, because I said, I don't want to go to Heritage. I was dragging my feet, and I told him why. And he said, let's just go. It's just across the bridge from me. And so I emailed them and made the arrangements. We went there. The vice president came out and met us in the parking lot, walked us in. We met the CEO, the CFO, and they walked us into this conference room where they had 6 carafes of different cask strength whiskeys that had just come of age, that they had been working on for bottling this line of higher end whiskeys that now is called Stiefel's Select. Justin Stiefel is the CEO, and his wife, I'm forgetting her name, is the CFO. Anyway, we went in, and they were I got the impression that they were sort of all sitting on the edge of their seat. They had the impression that we were the whiskey experts, that were the first whiskey experts coming to taste their new upscale products. And everything we tasted just blew us away. And Alan was blown away too. And Alan's Scotch collection defies belief. But so for him to be blown away with American craft whiskey is really saying something. But we were just, well, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. This is fantastic. They were at the time building out their warehouse, building a new rick house, and getting prepared to move into that. And the distiller came in, Dane, their head distiller, came in. He's a fantastic guy towards the end of the session. And he said, what I can't wait to get to, they had a lot of their whiskey in storage containers, like shipping containers. A lot of the barrels just stuck in shipping containers. He said, what I can't wait to is getting to that container that has the chocolate malted barley whiskey. And my ears perked up immediately. And I said, what? And had a bit of a conversation about it. And I said, when you get into that, would you please send me samples? And so they did. And the first time I put this to my nose, it was whiskey really evokes memories, especially from childhood, a lot for me. And this put me right back to being a kid, sneaking down into the basement pantry and stealing a whole box of Betty Crocker brownie mix, taking it up to my bedroom and eating the whole thing with a spoon. It's just
that's not usually the kind of theft confession we get on this.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. But this is just it puts me right there. It's just it's not one sort of chocolate. It's every sort of, it's a complex blend of every sort of chocolate, from cocoa to milk chocolate to dark chocolate to baker's chocolate. Um, and it's just a fascinating whiskey. And I went and spilled to buy 3 barrels of it, so there will be more of it coming. But I was just that impressed that I bought more of it than anything else. And it's a bit crazy because it doesn't sell itself. Looking at the label, people are like, "What's that? I've never had anything like that before." And it looks like maybe it's flavored with chocolate or something. But
it hit me upside the head with chocolate when I cracked the sample bottle.
yeah.
I didn't even have to pour it. I didn't even have to stick my nose in the glass. It was just like big chocolate. The flavor note for me, you were talking about your brownies. For me, it was the Little Debbie brownie cakes that have the brownie and the icing on top and the sprinkles. That's what this tastes like to me.
Yeah. And it again, it's not just whiskey flavored whiskey. It's not just chocolate whiskey flavored whiskey. It is incredibly complex. And there's a lot of, like we were just talking about, herbal stuff going on, especially like fried sage leaf. That's really delightful, especially towards the finish. And it has the flavors of old whiskey too. It's like sitting in an old leather armchair in a very old library reading a really old dusty book. It's got all of that stuff. So it's a lovely whiskey. I just love this, and it's I think it's the favorite among my whiskey friends, oddly enough. They've been very, very full of praise about all 6 of my whiskeys, but this is the one that they come back to over and over again.
So I hinted at a bit of a preamble. You covered most of it, especially in terms of the label. But when I first looked at this, I said, "Oh, that's, it sounds basically like it's an American single malt, but it's not labeled like it's an American single malt. So what's the deal with that?" And then I looked into it, and I saw the label just says whiskey, which, okay, that's true of most American single malt too. You've got to put whiskey in a different font, larger, blah blah blah. But this one just says whiskey. It doesn't say American single malt. And it's called the chocolate malted barley whiskey. And I said, there's got to be a reason for that. So I looked at the mash bill, and it's 10% malted, 90% unmalted. And I said, okay, cool. We're in like Pachin single pot still territory here, kind of.
Yeah.
Or another way of looking at it is that what we have is something that's kind of adjacent to a 100% rye whiskey, where most of it is unmalted rye and a certain portion of it is malted rye.
Yeah. Yep. There's no reason they couldn't have made it 90% malted barley and 10% chocolate malt, and then it would have been a single malt. But they didn't. The 90% is unmalted barley, which is typical of Irish whiskeys. Irish whiskeys are a mixture of malted and unmalted barley. So if you want to draw that parallel, that's sort of true.
I suppose they could have done everything. It's 100% malted, but there's a percent that's chocolate malted. Would have been an American single malt, right?
Yeah.
Well, they could have, and they didn't, and I think it was an interesting choice. And because of that similarity to the rye kind of profile that I mentioned, that blend of malted and unmalted rye, I pulled out my Balcones Texas rye, which is 100% rye, some of which is malted. And has an interesting chocolate cake, herbal profile. And aside from this being really chocolate cake on the nose, the rest of the profile to this was really familiar to me.
Yeah.
And I think that they compared really well to each other, just as an interesting comparison, an interesting side by side, where neither kind of blew the other out of the water. And there was interesting notes you could find by doing that comparison. Even though one is all barley and one is all rye, there's a similarity in that production. Not to mention the new oak and the aggressive aging. And
yeah, that's cool. But this is definitely like, I've never had a whiskey anything like this, and I can't imagine you quite have too. I mean, you can draw some cool parallels to that rye, but it's a completely different animal.
I mean, something that is 90% unmalted barley as its majority ingredient. We don't have a name for that. There's no name in our regulations for that.
No,
And there's a
no.
name for practically everything that's a majority ingredient.
Yeah.
But unmalted barley whiskey is not an option. Of all of the options and et ceteras that the TTB allows and the standards of
Yep.
identity have, this
Yep.
is not one of them. So all you can say is whiskey. And I thought that was super cool. So just as a regulations nerd, I mean, this is really tasty whiskey, but
Yeah.
as a regulations nerd, that's what really got me. This is a talking point. I want to tell people about that. People who know enough about whiskey to know why that's cool.
Yeah.
I want to talk about it.
Yeah. And also, I think, says something about the quality of the taste and smell of this whiskey, because that's a hurdle. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't sell itself. It's difficult to label a label that just says whiskey, and then you've got to look at the small print to see what the heck's going on. I've got to get people to taste it, and the reason that I was able to look past that hurdle is just, I think this is a fantastic whiskey. I think it's just delightful.
I don't recall if I said what happened with water on the last one. So I'm just gonna throw this out there just real quick. So when I added water to the last one, I got all the elements of fruitcake came out of it. The blinking owl. So I got the candied pear, the sort of like the candy maraschino cherries that are kind of in there, and like a molasses, like the sort of like the cake crumb, calling on my British Bake Off knowledge.
Somebody
has molasses in it.
Sorry, I mean interrupt.
No, I was just finishing a thought, but go ahead.
I was just looking on Whiskey Base, and all my whiskeys are there. That's primarily a Scotch database online. It's a great resource. But there's all sorts of world whiskeys and US whiskeys on there too. But all of mine are there, and I've just gotten a few entries and a few reviews, and the most recent that I went on and saw, a guy had written a review of this, and he kept calling it a sherried whiskey, and it's very clearly not on the label and everything else, but I can completely understand because of the dark color, the deep dark color. Somebody coming from Scotch would be used to that meaning sherry, and like you're saying, a lot of the tasting notes, it's like you could almost believe that this was matured in French oak, because of all the Christmas cake stuff that comes through, like you're saying. It's pretty incredible. All the baking spice stuff that you get from sherried whiskeys and from French oak.
That's the blinking owl, or the
the blinking owl. Talking about the blinking. We're jumping around a bit here, but
sorry, I'm confusing myself, so I'm sure we're confusing the audience.
That's all right.
Let's bring it back to the chocolate malted one.
The guy that I just saw reviewing the blinking owl kept calling it sherried, and talking about Christmas cake flavors, and I'm like, well, all that's there in the baking spice that you normally get from sherried whiskey, so I can understand the confusion and that he just made an assumption, but it's not. It's not sherried. It's not matured in the next sherry cask or anything.
Yeah, so it does make sense. Let's so I put some drops of water in this one, and just real quick, just in the interest of moving along, I'll just say that my notes from yesterday, when I added water, it became chocolate pecan pie. So still that chocolate, but more nuts, and it sort of came together into that memory of that sort of Thanksgiving dessert.
Yep. And it gets a little more herbal with water too. That sage sort of floats to the top, but
I think there must be something that's a pie crust kind of element to that, that's sort of lending to that sort of pie. But it's like, all of these whiskeys are so well integrated, they're actually really hard to pull tasting notes out of, which, like, that's a compliment and also a frustration as a reviewer. I want to have at least 2 or 3 really distinct tasting notes that if you taste it, hopefully you'll get the same.
Thanks.
And I also indulge in adding another 8 just for fun as I go through whatever I get, and my style is a wall of tasting notes. But there are some whiskeys where that's tough.
That's certainly true. There is a sort of a pastry element to it, and a pie crust element to it, and I I guess that sort of integrates or fits with the cocoa element of it, that it's that dry, flaky sort of feeling, especially in the texture of it. Although it is a very rich whiskey. There is that cocoa and a pastry element to it for sure.
All right, so moving on to the fourth in the line, we have the Other Heritage. This is the 100% rye whiskey.
Yep. And I just got it. Have you ever had a chocolate croissant or pain au chocolat with the
favorite thing? That was my favorite thing to get when I was in Quebec. Going to the French bakery and order a pain au chocolat.
Yeah. So that's a good tasting note for that whiskey, for that chocolate malted barley whiskey, I think. Yeah. So this is the second Heritage Distilling whiskey. Here's the bottle for you.
Make that big.
It's a 6-year-old rye. I don't think I've been saying the ages on these, huh? So the Copperworks was 6, the Blinking Owl is 5 years old, and the chocolate malted barley is 5 years old. This rye is 6 years old. It's 100% rye. You don't see as many 100% ryes because it's difficult to work with. It gets gummy and sticky. The mash does, and it's a pain in the ass to clean up. Anyway, this is 100% rye, and when I first had this, what really struck me is ryes are usually big, heavy, deeper notes along with the mint, the typical rye spice and mint. But this really has some floral notes to it too. Like I get dandelion when you're a kid and you take a yellow dandelion flower and smash it between your hands like that and smell. And marigold and yellow flowers like that. On the nose, it's got all these delicate floral notes, and then it gets into in the palate. You hit the rye spice and leather and all those heavier, deeper notes. But I just thought that span, ryes usually hit like mid and what I would say heavier tasting notes, and this one has the whole spectrum, which I'd never really gotten from a rye, and I like ryes a great deal. But
all right, I'm going to make a recommendation for you then in terms of rye. So Wilderness Trail Distillery rye does the same thing with that full spectrum.
Really? I've got a Wilderness Trail, but it might be a bourbon. I'll have to look and give that a shot after we're done here.
You can definitely tell me if I'm wrong. Subjective palates and all. But that's one of my favorite ryes. So a little bit more roll call. So I think we got a couple of people come in from Freedom Malts' streams. Yep. So Freedom Malts is here. So thanks for stopping by to check this out. How'd your stream go? Earlier when we were getting started, I dropped a comment in their chat that I couldn't stay because they were having Freedom Malts. Germ is doing a blind samples showdown challenge, which he sends blind whiskeys of any type from any country, a pack of 3 to people from Instagram and YouTube and so on, and then they have a competition of who can guess closest, essentially, to what it really is. It's a lot of fun. I'm a part of that. I did season 1 and I did season 2, and I lost my first round in season 1, but I won my first round in season 2. So I will get another shot, and I'm going up against somebody who is an actual professional whiskey taster my next round.
Oh, nice.
Jack Begadou, I think is how you pronounce his name, the Hood Sommelier. So I'm intimidated by that for sure. Germ says the final score was 9-8. I guess that's a little bit of a spoiler, but anybody who's watching this who didn't watch that, you should go watch that show. It's a lot of fun. Also, I think you just sold Ali on more of your products.
Yeah, he says he bought them. So he bought them at he must have bought them at Scotch whiskey auctions, because the last month was those first 2 casks, and he got one of each of them. Good, right on, Ali. Let me know what you think. happy to jump online and taste them together sometime. That would be good.
Oh, the Sugar Kitty a little while ago said cosmic brownies. I think that's probably what the Little Debbies are called, or an alternative version of the same idea.
Oh, right. Cool.
The multicolored sprinkles.
Yeah. And someone had asked something about Del Bach earlier.
Yes. So we'll bring that up now, or we could wait until the smoky.
That's all right. No, I would love to bottle Del Bach. I visited the distillery. I tasted a bunch of stuff. They sent me samples, and a couple of single casks, things that they had finished in, one in Sauterne and one in something else, and they were beautiful. And my hiccup, which has nothing to do with them, they're in Tucson, so they mature stuff for like a year in much smaller barrels. I think like 30 liter, 50 liter, 30 liter, smaller barrels.
Small format, yeah.
And so their maturation is like a year, and they're great. The stuff matures really quickly because it's in Tucson. It's hot as hell and cold as heck, and the seasons have great swings, and they lose a lot to the angel share. My hiccup was, what I couldn't get my head around was, for my first release, I'm wanting to put the age statement on the label in bold print. I want that on my front label as it is. You can see like the big number 5 there, 5 years old. And I just couldn't get my head around putting the number 1 on a label, especially with my first, with my inaugural release. So that was all on me, and I think they've got fantastic whiskey, and I certainly hope to bottle their whiskey, and I will be hitting them up in the fairly near future to pick a cask for sure. And we'll talk about that with what I'm up to in the future, because they're going to fit right into that.
Yep. So Phil clarified 15-gallon barrels, which he remembers from our interview with Mark.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
As well, Mark from Whiskey Del Bach, I should clarify. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. He's fantastic. Met him, talked with him, drank with him at the distillery. And their distiller is fantastic too. Really nice people there. And it's just unfortunate that I had that hiccup, not wanting to put 1-year-old whiskey out in my inaugural release.
Yeah, especially with the age statement front and center. It's a very, this sort of brings me to the question of like how you got into whiskey in the first place. But that idea of putting an age statement front and center in large type on a bottle is a very Scotchy thing to do, a very Scotch single malt thing to do.
Yep.
And people who come from the world of Scotch, like myself and Phil and a lot of other people who are now getting into American single malt, who I know, most of the people getting into American single malt are people I know from the Scotch review space. And several years ago, especially in the context of talking about Ardbeg, people were having a hard time wrapping their mind around the idea that a no age statement whiskey could be every bit as good as an age stated whiskey. Which dovetails a little bit with, like, if you're getting into American whiskey, age statements were uncommon, getting more common. But they're all low, 4, 6, 8 years old, not the 12, 15, 18, 21, 25, 33, the kinds of things you get from Scotland. Partly things age quickly, partly because new oak. And a big part for American single malt, these distilleries aren't old enough yet to have whiskey that's that old, right? They're getting there. Right. Our favorite McCarthy's a few years ago started coming out with a 6-year, and we have in the back of our minds there's every possibility that they have a 10-year coming soon, just on the fact that they almost certainly have 10-year-old barrels in the barrel house, right? Like, they haven't told us anything. Caitlin Bartlemay sometimes leaks secrets to us, but she's been very mum on the question of age statements. So this is all just us guessing.
Yeah.
Age statement, maybe just throwing this out there, adding in a different label design that accommodates for a no age statement type of release would not be a bad idea. But you do you. I appreciate that that transparency and highlighting these certain aspects of your labels.
Yeah, that was the idea, that I'm wanting to be completely transparent, and how long something's been matured is an obvious piece of information that I think should be passed on. Yes, NAS whiskeys can be every bit as good as age statement whiskeys. No question, no quibble there. The one thing I would add that I think is really explains all of what is going on with American whiskeys that are much younger than Scotch is just load up Google Earth and follow the latitude from the Highlands of Scotland across to the North American continent, and you end up north of Juneau, Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you end up. So you're
wild.
So you're looking at a much cooler climate, and you're also looking at a climate that is much more humid. They've got they're surrounded by ocean. They've got lochs all over the place, water just running through the whole of Scotland. So the reason why American whiskey matures so much more quickly and so much more is lost to evaporation is fairly simple chemistry that I think I can describe. It's the difference in Scotland, the Highlands of Scotland versus America. The percentage of alcohol in the ambient atmosphere is exactly the same. It's 0. Mm-hmm. There is no alcohol in the atmosphere, or in the air that we're breathing. What is different is the amount of water in the air that we're in the ambient atmosphere. So most of America is much more arid than Scotland, which is very humid, although it's cool. So temperature and that factor, the aridity, are what are driving the rapid maturation of American whiskeys. Because there is so little water in the atmosphere, especially like in the Southwest, that's why, like we were talking about, Del Bach in Tucson, Arizona, matures their whiskey for a year in smaller casks. They are losing the same amount of alcohol as they are in Scotland, but they are losing a whole lot more water because there is so much less water in the ambient atmosphere. The water is evaporating from the cask so much quicker. When we get to our last whiskey, Santa Fe Spirits, I have read, I think that their Angel's share is about 12%, that they lose about 12% volume per year. So for this whiskey, that last one that we're going to get to make it to 6 years old is pretty extraordinary. I don't know. They may have combined a couple barrels after 3 years or something into one barrel or something. I don't know how they got that much volume, but it was the fewest bottles that I got out of any of my the whiskeys that I barreled, and out of any of my single barrels. 148 bottles. Yeah.
That reminds me, while we're on the topic of the mesquite smoked in the Southwest, and we were talking about Mark. Not only do we have an interview with Mark Vierthaler, which is master distiller of Whiskey Del Bach, we also have a roundtable featuring Mark and Colin Keegan from Santa Fe and Moose Allen from Andalusia talking about mesquite smoked.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's fantastic. I owe those guys a couple bottles. I hand delivered 2 bottles to each of the distilleries I worked with in the Northwest, but the only one I ended up bottling in this first round from the Southwest is Santa Fe Spirits. So I have a couple bottles set aside that I need to get shipped to them somehow, for sure. But they've been great. They were fantastic to work with. And so do we want to talk about this rye anymore? Or are we ready to?
I think we should move on for sure.
All right.
So just one more tasting note I wanted to add in here. I got rose water.
Yep, for sure.
So that fits into that really floral um, high notes that you were talking about. I don't really have any memories of the dandelions and the marigolds as much, but rosewater,
Yep.
that's childhood memories for me because my family is Eastern European and we used to go get baklava from the market all the time. And, pistachios, rosewater, phyllo dough, walnuts, honey, those are all flavors of
Yeah.
the sweets of my childhood.
Yeah. It's nice. Rose hip tea too has a lot of that flavor.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one on the list is the 2-bar
Yes.
X-Red Wine Cask Straight Bourbon Whiskey.
Yep. So 2-bar makes fantastic bourbon. The what makes it really unique, I think, is their mash bill is 60% corn, 6% wheat, and what's that? 34% malted barley, and it's a variety of malted barleys, which are that I have. He has told me everything that goes into it. The percentages are proprietary, apparently. But a very small bit of that I know is chocolate malted barley. So you may be getting a tiny bit of that, nothing close to the 10% that is in the chocolate malted barley whiskey. But this, people talk about wheated bourbons. This, I guess you could say, is a malted bourbon. I don't think I've ever had a bourbon. I don't think I've ever had a bourbon that has that high of a malted barley percentage in it. Probably one of the reasons is malt is more expensive than almost any other grain, and corn is cheap as chips. So they probably stick to having a larger than the required 51% corn. But this has all that malt in it, which I think, and no rye. That's the other thing. It's pretty unique in that it has no rye in it. But it's finished in a Washington State red wine barrel. They also finish some of their bourbon in ex-amaretto casks. And when I first went there and tried that, this was the best bourbon that they had. This finished in the Washington State red wine barrel. The amaretto, I felt like wanted more time in the amaretto casks. I wanted more amaretto from it.
That's surprising.
And the second time I went, this last time, fairly recently, that's exactly what they've done, not by my asking or my suggestion or anything. They've just been finishing it longer in the amaretto, and good God, is it fantastic. I'm going to get a barrel of that in the near future. It's really wonderful whiskey, really fantastic whiskey. But this, in addition to the malt content, making it, I think, more complex and delicate for a bourbon, it also, that Washington State red wine barrel just puts it straight into like strawberry, tons of strawberry strudel, strawberry cheesecake, all of that. It's really, really wonderful. So to add that much strawberry to a really well-made bourbon is what caught me about this. Again, there's some baked stuff in there. Like I said, it's sort of a strawberry strudel, some toasted and baked fruits in it.
So even though there's no or minimal rye in this, no rye, right?
No rye.
This, among all the bourbons that I have, or that I've spent more time with, because this counts as having,
yes,
and I have lots of samples. But out of all the full bottles of bourbon I have, I think this is most similar to the Knob Creek.
Huh. Interesting.
It's got a peanutty kind of nose, and when I did my notes on this one, I actually came at it in another session, so I didn't immediately before that have the 4 things that we just had. And it was coming across as a lot more dry to me than it's coming across now. I get the strawberry now, and I get the cherry almond toffee peanuts sort of thing now, but what I was mostly getting earlier was like dry leaves and fruit leather.
Yeah.
And those kinds of notes.
Yep.
So I don't usually talk about my tasting notes across multiple tastings, because I do the review a long time ago and then we have an interview, or we just do the notes live. But there's a lot of reviews that I've half written. I say half written. They're basically done, but I have never posted it because I felt like I didn't get everything that I wanted to. I didn't feel like I had fully explored the whiskey yet.
Yep.
And so I come back to it on a different palette with a different contrast on another day and write some different tasting notes and then kind of combine them together and figure out how I felt about it in terms of putting a score on it. So I'm glad that I've actually had the chance to do that with most of these whiskeys I've already had twice, even before our meeting here. So I'm not doing the live notes thing very well because I'm basically sort of like, I'm giving some impressions, but I'm also going back to my notes to say, like, what did I get? Which I think there's so much here that calling out the most interesting bits that I've gotten across multiple tastings is a really cool thing to do.
Yep.
Let's see. Oh, cinnamon candies, a little bit of dry fennel I got, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I held up the bottle for this one. So the different colors on the labels serve just one purpose, to differentiate the bottles.
Okay.
So anyone looking at two bottles on a shelf can see that they're different whiskeys immediately.
Okay, so there's no color coding of type?
No, yeah, I know Lost Lantern is doing that they've got one color for ryes, one color for bourbons, one color for single malts, that sort of thing. We picked a palette of 18 colors that would work, and especially we wanted that black bar, the print, to be legible with color, contrasting with the black. So we picked a palette of 18 colors that did that, and I think we'll just rotate through those. So that's that. What I picked up this bottle because I was going to read what I wrote for the tasting notes. Two Barb Spirits makes an excellent bourbon. Some of it they finish in Washington State red wine barrels. This cask blends the flavors of fresh baked strawberry pie and spiced strawberry mead to the gingerbread and cedar campfire of their delicious bourbon. Yeah, so those are my notes, I think. That's where I'm at.
I got cedar on one of these. Did I get it on this one? It might have been this one. I did not write it down, which means I was verbalizing it on a Discord call.
Yeah.
But I definitely got cedar on one of these.
It's a really easy drinking bourbon. It's the lowest ABV of any of them. It's 58.94. So it still wants a bit of water, but it's a really lovely, very easily drinkable bourbon. It's a bit different than most any bourbon I've ever had. With that mash bill that we discussed and being finished in a Washington State red wine barrel.
All right, so I'm going to add a little water to this one, and while I'm sort of waiting for that to settle in, I've got a couple of other questions, so we can sort of divert from the specific whiskey for a moment.
Yes.
So you are a very small outfit. You've got 6 casks so far. In terms and 1,300 bottles total, or something along those lines, something close to that.
Yep.
You have done an interesting combination of flying under the radar and making a really big splash all at once. I've been following your brand since I first saw your TTB label submissions via the Coming Whiskey account, Jacob Kuiper.
Yeah.
Who also reviews for Drink Hackers. So there are 2 at least full sets of reviews of these products out. I'll be submitting, the 3rd set myself. One of them is on Drink Hacker. One of them is on Whiskey Fun.
Oh, awesome.
So I don't know if you knew that, but people have noticed your products because Serge reviewed, especially the Copperworks, he reviewed extremely favorably.
Yeah.
And
All
he's
of them,
reviewed
actually.
all of your,
Yeah. He initially, I managed to get, I've got my girlfriend lives in Scotland. She lives in Kintyre, the Kintyre Peninsula, going down to Springbank, the north end of it. My last visit to her, I brought over sample bottles, hoping to get them to Serge. I tried to get them via another means, but FedEx did not get them overnight to the person who was going over to Europe. So I flew over with them, hoping to get them to Serge, messaged him, and he said that he was going to be at a whiskey festival in Glasgow, the Whiskey Fringe in Glasgow, or in Edinburgh, but he was going to be in Glasgow for a night. I said told him I was flying into Glasgow. So he said, why don't you just drop them at my hotel? And so I dropped them at his hotel. He picked them up the next week. And within 2 weeks, he had reviewed 4 of them. So the end of our trip, or the end of my visit with my girlfriend, Susan, all of a sudden I'm getting messages from whiskey friends saying Serge reviewed them. And of all 6 of them, he gave an 87, an 89, 3 90s, and a 91. He gave a 91 to the rye. And for Serge to give those scores to young American whiskeys is just crazy and extremely flattering. A lot of great scotches he's reviewing, in the mid and low 80s, and saves like scores of like 95-ish range for, like 1970s, 1960s Ardbegs and crazy stuff that's just stratospherically good. So I was just jumping up and down, couldn't sit in my seat in her car as we're driving back from our trip to the Isle of Skye when I saw that. And then he reviewed the other 2 a few weeks later. So incredibly flattering and affirming that I'm on the right track.
That's awesome that you had a personal hand in delivering the samples to Serge. It's not something someone else sent him or he came by himself, but that you actually. So how did you get that contact? I mean,
I have never met him. Like I said, I came from Scotch. I came to American whiskey from Scotch. My background is with Scotch, and he, in terms of education, Serge and Ralphie does tons of YouTube videos. I think he's over 1,000 now. But those were my 2 biggest influences early on. And still, I go back to when I'm buying Scotch or interested in a bottle, I go to see what Serge reviewed it as. I think he is Serge Valentine at whiskeyfun.com is in my mind, he's the most prestigious reviewer of Scotch whiskey, and he regularly reviews world whiskeys, American whiskeys, and also rums and cognacs and armagnacs and other things as well. So my financier, Alan, has met him and spoken with him a few times going to a whiskey festival in Limburg, Germany. Alan was the one I was trying to get to take the samples over to him, but FedEx didn't get them to Alan overnight like they were supposed to. So I was stranded. So Serge knows Alan just briefly, and I mentioned Alan, but I don't really have a connection or any reason that he would have to skew his scores any higher. And besides that, I think he's oozing integrity and wouldn't do that for anyone anyway. So I'm taking it as straight compliment and flattery that it apparently is.
Yeah, I think everyone else has also felt the same way. I mean, there are a few ways that you made it onto the map, right? Your first splash is the TTB labels, and Jake and I were looking at those, going, "This is the most transparent thing we've ever seen in American whiskey." Like, almost.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, there are some that have matched, but for a brand new brand to come out of nowhere and put all this transparency on a label is something we deeply respect and appreciate. And then we were just looking out for, you know, when those products hit the market. Jacob reviewed them right away. I've been waiting my turn patiently, and I'm glad that I finally got a chance to speak with you. It's been quite a pleasure to taste through these products and sort of and see the new, you know, independent bottling several years ago was basically unheard of in the United States.
Yeah.
Unless you were a Scotch nerd.
Yep.
And then Single Cask Nation was doing a little bit of American bottling, but they focused all of their attention on Scotch, and they were acting as a Scotch independent bottler that just happened to be based out of the United States. And then you had Lost Lantern come on and do all of the independent bottling things. And that's great when there's one.
Yes.
Two, if you count Single Cask Nation. But to see three doing this great level of transparency and sourcing excellent casks and singing the praises of these brands that that may fly under the radar, independent bottling in the United States is truly coming into its own. And I'm absolutely pleased that as an American single malt focused podcast, we've gotten to speak to all three of those American independent bottlers at this point. My interview with Single Cask Nation, unfortunately, the recording didn't work. So I have no evidence that I did that, but at some point we'll re-record and actually get an episode out. It's really cool to see. I think that American single malt as a movement works even better because you have all of the things that go along with single malt, including the independent bottling. As in my book, you're doing part of the job of making American single malt successful, and I appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you very much. That's very high praise. Thanks. It means a lot.
So now I've done my 5 minutes of fanboying. Now we can get back to the whiskey.
God, that I should even think of having anybody fanboying is just a bit silly.
Okay,
anyway.
So Santa Fe is up next.
All right. Yes, we're wrapping up with Santa Fe, and then we'll talk about let's talk about this whiskey, and then we'll talk about what the future holds for American Single Cask.
Awesome.
Here is the label, and the most extraordinary thing about this whiskey is the age statement. As I hit on earlier, much earlier in the conversation, for an American whiskey out of Santa Fe to make it to 6 years old is pretty extraordinary. The like I said, their Angel's share, which is the percentage that they lose to evaporation by volume per year, is from what I've read 12% in Santa Fe. It's at I think Santa Fe is at like 7,200 feet elevation. It's way up there, and it's still in the desert Southwest. It gets hot in the summer and very cold in the winter. They get plenty of snow in the wintertime. So they've got these huge fluctuations in temperature, which also encourages evaporation from the cask. It's very arid, very dry. So that, as we've spoken about, as we've also talked about, increases the evaporation. When they sent me samples, this was the oldest, and it ended up being the best. They make a mesquite smoked single malt that they call Colkeegan, is the brand name. Colin Keegan is the founder of the distillery. And so that's a little play on his name that they decided to call it because it sounded like it was a Scotch, which was the idea that he came up with, and similarly Del Bach came up with, was what if instead of a single malt smoked with peat smoke, as they do in Scotland, we smoked it with mesquite smoke, which is mesquite is a very scrubby, thorny tree/bush that grows in dry desert washes. And it is used regularly as Southwest barbecue wood. So many people who live in the Southwest anywhere, maybe elsewhere, you've had mesquite smoked chicken sandwich or something like that, or mesquite barbecue. And the flavor that and the smell that comes off of this whiskey is just the mesquite smoke just rolls off of this glass. This is bottled at 65% even. So like all of them, that's a really stout whiskey and it wants water. This might be about the oldest whiskey from Santa Fe Spirits that's ever been bottled. I don't know that even their single cask bottlings, I don't think any of them most of them are like 4 years old or so. The ones that I have are. But this is 6. And so in addition to that mesquite barbecue and the mesquite smoke that comes rolling off of it, it really has the feel of old, and the feel and the smell and the taste of old whiskey. It really hits those leather and tobacco notes again, especially in the finish. So it goes right from that mesquite barbecue smoke in the nose and the palate, and right on into that those leather and tobacco notes in the finish. It's really a delightful old whiskey.
This is my favorite of the set.
Really? Wow.
I think so. I am a peat fiend. I love smoky whiskey. There was a long time in early 2021 where I pretty much didn't drink anything that wasn't peaty, or it was unimpressive to me for a while, until I was educated with much better whiskeys. Of course, there's quite a lot of really good whiskey that isn't smoky. But for me, smoke, just as a first touch point, is a callback to my early days of being a single malt enjoyer, mostly Scotch single malts.
Yeah.
And I would say on the scale of smoky whiskey, I think the age has tamped down the smoke on this one actually pretty significantly. It's not the outright smoky campfire kind of thing. If anything, it's a little earthy, medicinal, like herbal medicine. And the most prominent tasting note I actually get from this is marzipan, and it took me a long time to nail it down, but I finally figured out it was pine nuts. And what I'm tasting through the finish of this is pinoli cookies.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I got they make a liqueur, and I got a bottle that's made from pine nuts and I think ponderosa pine sap. And it was really extraordinary. I still have it. I haven't opened it. I'll open that when maybe when at the next gathering of Ardbegeddon, which is something that happens in Las Vegas that's pretty fantastic. It's been going 20 years now. I was super.
Did you say
lucky.
Ardbegeddon?
Yes, was super lucky to get involved. It's they bunch of guys from all over the U.S. and some from Europe come and rent a house that sleeps about 20. And there's usually somewhere between 20 and 35, 40 people there. And there's a huge dining room table in this house. And the 2 rules are bring really good whiskey. And number 2 is don't be an asshole. And everybody brings absolutely stellar whiskey and puts it on this dining room table. And you just sit and drink and have great company for a week. And it might be, I've talked
for a
with
week.
Yeah.
Wow.
I've talked with many people, and they and I think everyone who's been would say that it is hands down the best whiskey event in the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I have a Scotch meetup group that meets every quarter, and so we just do one night of same deal. Bring awesome whiskey. Sometimes we do themes, but bring awesome whiskey. Don't be a dick.
Yeah.
Drive home safe.
Yeah. I don't know how I got onto that. Anyway,
just good whiskey. Yeah. We're at that point in the night. So I'm going to add some water to this. And once again, I'm going to ask you some questions that aren't directly related to the whiskey while we let that settle in.
Go for it. So I think the one topic that's outstanding is where American Single Cask is going, or what the plans are.
We'll get to that, but I
All right.
actually do want to talk a bit about your life outside of whiskey.
Okay.
Because it turns out that we have some interesting serendipitous parallels that we didn't really know about before, that I was just learning about during our sort of pre-show chat. So first of all, when I got the notification that you were shipping these samples for me, I actually didn't know. I hadn't done my research yet because we had just gotten in touch, and you were like, yeah, sure, we'll do the interview. I'll send you samples. I was so busy at that time that I didn't have time to do the research. I didn't know you were based in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
So I was actually headed to a work conference in Las Vegas, and I saw the email that you had sent the samples from Las Vegas like a day after I had left Las Vegas.
Yeah. That's a
So
shame.
I thought that was really funny because we could have met up if I had any time in my schedule. And as I was saying, we had a packed itinerary, so that was probably not going to happen. But
it would have been great.
That was just really funny.
It would have been great to have you over for a few drams. Yeah, that would have been awesome.
So next time we will. And here's the other part that I didn't talk about in the pre-show. So if you don't mind talking about what you do for a living.
Yes.
Don't
mind at all.
So just briefly, what is it that you do?
I am a full-time poker dealer at Wynn Las Vegas. Well, the poker room has moved next door to the sister property called Encore. I have been there since day one when the Wynn opened in 2005. I quit at Bellagio and came to the Wynn. And so I'm a day one employee. It will be 20 years next April. But yeah, I'm a full-time poker dealer, and got really heavily into whiskey, fell in love with whiskey, and found myself buying all the bottles that I wanted. And eventually when I couldn't get what I wanted in the US, I started looking at Scotch whiskey auctions in Scotland, and buying things there, and also realized the value of antique Scotch. And so started looking at antique auctions and buying whiskey at antique auctions. And most of the stuff that I got in the UK, I would never touch. I would buy it at antique auctions that had, and estate sale auctions that had a couple bottles of whiskey that they had found in the cellar or cabinets or the attic or whatever. And I would just know that they would sell for more money in specialist Scotch whiskey auctions than they would in the antique auctions or the estate sale auctions. So I would, if I won the auction, I'd have a mailboxes, et cetera, or something, go and pick it up and ship it to the whiskey auctions. And that was funding. Some of those bottles I would keep for myself if they were especially interesting, but that was funding my early love of whiskey. And I was just churning all those profits into buying whiskey that I wanted for myself. And that's how I built the bar behind you and more, and fell in love with Scotch. We started here from talking about smoke and peat smoke in particular. My journey really in whiskey started from loving the outdoors in Southern Nevada. There was so much beautiful desert wilderness, easily accessible from Las Vegas. So I was going out there doing caving and exploring and discovering caves. And we would go with our off-road vehicles, our SUVs, and we would pack a big cooler of beer. And eventually we wanted to get out further, and we started backpacking. And you have to backpack in your water. There are very few opportunities to get to hit a spring or water source in the desert. So we were backpacking in all our water, and the most you could backpack is about 3 days of water. And that meant leaving the beer behind. Well, then we started turning to whiskey, and we were filling up a Nalgene of bourbon or Irish whiskey. And then about that time, I happened to run across, in a couple of weeks, I ran across 2 Discovery Channel type programs about the world of whiskey. And they were like, here's what makes bourbon, bourbon. Here's what makes Canadian whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Canadian whiskey. Here's what makes Irish whiskey. And then in Scotland, there's these different regions. And they were talking about and then they talked about the island of Islay. And they said, most of those whiskeys are still peat smoked, and they dry the malted barley over peat smoke, and that the flavor of that smoke gets into the liquor, stays in the liquor. And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I went and bought a bottle of Lafroig right away, tried it, didn't like it, tried it again a month later and loved it, and took it to my buddy Tom, who was my constant companion outdoors, and said, you've got to try this. And I poured him a glass, and he took a sip, and he said, that is the best thing I've ever put in my mouth. And from then on, I just wanted to try everything in Scotch, and then started realizing that what was happening with this craft whiskey boom in America, and fell in love here. And that sort of terroir is what another thing that I'm most interested in with American Single Cask is people using local grains, things like mesquite smoked from Southwest barbecue wood, finishing them in barrels, barrels from local wineries, that sort of thing. The more local, the better, because I think, to sound a bit pompous, I think whiskey, when it's at its best, is sort of a sense of place distilled. And so that sort of morphs into talking about where American Single Cask is going, because I've got my next 6 barrels pretty well picked out. I can tell you it will be 10 years old by the time it's bottled, probably, a Westward, Westland. God, that's a tough mistake to make.
They're in good humor about it. So
yes.
I've got a Westland here.
Yeah, a Westland. It's an American single malt that is from a second fill sherry cask, and it will be probably 10 years old by the time I bottle it. It's wonderful. It's a perfect balance. Because it's second fill, it's not just sherry juice. I had some first fill sherry matured whiskey there too, and it just overpowered their really wonderful, delicate spirit. So that I'm bottling 2 from a distillery that you might not even have heard of, Stark Spirits in Pasadena.
I actually have heard of Stark. I may even have a sample near me.
So I think I've got 2 barrels locked down. One is ex-bourbon and one is new oak, and they're both wonderful. I've just finally got a solid connection with Dry Fly Distillery in Spokane, Washington, and I'm bottling one of their whiskeys.
Awesome.
And then 2 more from Heritage, a 5-grain bourbon and another barrel of this chocolate malted barley whiskey. So the round after next is the one I'm really excited about. It's going to be, I think it's just going to be American Smoke. And the cornerstone is a barrel I managed to get from Heritage. I don't know if you know, well, I'm sure you know, because Copperworks and Westland both are bottling American Single Malt, peated with Washington State peat.
That's one of my favorite geeky topics to get into.
Yeah. So I asked both of them, and both of them were firm no's, like they are not giving up any of those barrels to anybody else. It actually all came from Skagit Valley Maltings, which has since gone bankrupt and closed, I think. So they are scrambling to get somebody else to supply that. They couldn't get for the longest time, they couldn't get Washington State peat. They had tried, but all of it is in protected wetlands. And then they finally found a peat bog on private property. It's underwater, so they got permission from the landowner and went and dredged up the peat, dried it out, and used it. That was all I knew, that those were the two distilleries that had it, and both of them gave me firm no's. And then on my last visit to Heritage, turns out, lo and behold, they had distilled a couple barrels of peated bourbon with Washington State peat.
That's very cool.
They had bottled one of them apparently, and it sold out really quickly. And they had a second one, and I got a no. And my response was, "What's the price of no?" and
that's a very Vegas mindset.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So everything's got a price. So I talked with the CEO at a video call with him, and he said, "Well, it's pretty easy to figure out. We already bottled and sold one of the barrels, and I got this much per bottle, and it would be roughly this many bottles." And he gave me an extraordinarily high number. And I went away and sat on that for a while. In the meantime, in this last visit to them, we'd also tried a whole bunch of cherry wood smoked whiskeys, a cherry wood smoked rye, cherry wood smoked bourbon, and a cherry wood smoked single malt. Which loved all of them, couldn't decide which I liked best. So I came back to him and said, "I can't make it work at that price that you've given me. I've done all the math." And I said, "But I have found a way that I might be able to make it work. I'll give you a couple grand more than you're asking if you will throw in a barrel of my choice of cherry wood smoked whiskey." And he went for it. He said yes. So that will work. I will not be making as much money on that peated bourbon, but it will be the cornerstone of what I'm going to do and do American smoke. I think I can get 6 or 7 different American smoked whiskeys. That I'll have the cherry wood, the Washington State peated bourbon. I know of a couple of distilleries that do applewood smoked single malt, a distillery that does Texas sun-dried sage smoked whiskey, and a distillery that does a hickory smoked whiskey. So I'm wanting to put all those together in a lineup and sort of accentuate that bit of terroir that is purely American. That this is showing off American smokes that Americans have used in cuisine and in barbecue, and maybe not the peat, but it is the American peat version of what Scotch whiskey does with peat. And I absolutely adore the American peat. It is nothing like Scottish peat. You shouldn't expect any of that. It comes across with a very gentle smoke, but this intense growing earthiness, damp earthiness that just adds a real complexity and a base that just expands the whiskey. It's really, really lovely stuff.
Completely agree. So I don't know if we talked about this at all. The reason this podcast exists is because I wanted to write a book about American single malt whiskey. And I wanted to do primary research. And then interviews led to, I really wish I had a place to put these interviews while I figure out the content of the book. And not all of the interview is going to make the cut for the book, right? Not all of this content. So let's make a podcast. So here's the podcast. And one of the big sections that I wanted to do in the book is this topic of, there's so much in smoke that you can do with smoke and different types of smoke that are historically relevant to the culinary palate of Americans.
Yes.
That you don't get anywhere else in the world. And, peat is the only smoke anybody talks about. And then you've got the sheep dung smoke from Iceland. And then you
Yes.
have the hardwood smokes of America that nobody else is really doing. And I think that's such a cool topic. I've written some articles on that topic. I expect it will take up a big portion of the book, but I also have reformulated the book a couple of times and don't want to bias to my preferences too much
Yeah.
in trying to cover a broad category such as this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I could talk endlessly about American smoke, and I've been on the hunt for hickory smoke. I didn't know there was one, so I would love the name of that distillery.
Oh, I can tell you, it's Rocktown.
Rocktown. Okay.
Rocktown does. If I get my flashlight, I could find the bottle. If I didn't ditch the flashlight when I was trying to straighten up my bar for this presentation. Oh, I've got my cell phone multifunctional tool. Give me 1 second, and I will find the bottle for you.
Oh, while you're looking, because we have dead air, and I should fill dead air. So the connection that I had on the casino dealing is I don't remember if this has come up on the podcast before, but one of the things I do as an occasional side gig, I've been dealing blackjack since college, early in college, and since about 2017, I've been trained to deal blackjack and craps at essentially a professional level. I do it for parties, no money involved. I subcontract for an entertainment company that does casino parties during the busy season. But I am told that with the training they've given me, I could audition at a casino and I would know everything I need to know. So I've been doing that for a long time. I've been dealing blackjack for so long that it's just boring to me at this point.
Yeah.
I find craps way more interesting, but craps as a game lives and dies by how much the players are enjoying each other's company.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you have to be really good at facilitating the players interacting, or it's no fun for anybody.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would go mad counting to 21 all day and dealing blackjack. It would make me crazy. The nice thing about poker is they aren't playing against the house. The players are playing against each other, and the house is just facilitating the game. And there's all sorts of activity going on. There's bluffing is a big part of the game. There's table talk. The players are chatting and interacting all the time because they're playing against each other. So it makes a much more interesting, engaging, entertaining dynamic, which has kept me sane for 26, 28 years, something like that now. Yeah. Here's the bottle.
Okay, so this is Rocktown,
Arkansas Hickory Smoked Whiskey. It's wheat based. It's red winter wheat, I think, if I remember right.
Okay, so not an American single malt. Sorry, I should have clarified.
Yep.
I'm looking for a hickory smoked American single malt, but
no,
I still want to try that. So
yeah. Hickory, whereas mesquite is the Southwest barbecue wood, hickory is the most dominant wood used for Southern barbecue. Yeah. So this is not. Yeah, I would love to try a hickory smoked single malt. I don't know of anybody that's done it, and maybe if and when I go to visit Rocktown, they'll have tried it and have some barrels set aside. That would be a wonderful surprise.
Yep. One can hope. Well,
yeah.
I'm all out of questions.
All right.
I haven't seen any extra ones in the chat, so I think I will say, all right, you may absolutely hate this, and I think this is a terrible idea, but I'm trying to stick to this bit.
Yes, go ahead.
So we used to say, hey, which of these things we just tried is our favorite? But then we decided sometimes that hurts feelings, and it would be better for us to just blend them all together.
Oh my God.
So I'm going to do that to stick to the bit. It might be terrible because these are a lot of different things. Maybe blending just the American single malts would make more sense, but that's not nearly as fun. I'll try that another time.
Oh my God. So we're going to blend mesquite smoked single malt, bourbon, 100% rye, chocolate malted barley, and 2 single malts. All right. I haven't finished any of these glasses I poured, so this will be relatively easy.
Yeah, I'm not gonna take any more out of the glasses to do this, but I am gonna pour all my glasses together. It's just, they say don't play with your food, but I think you should play with your whiskey.
Yes, I do too.
It's not a euphemism. Just
nope,
for you.
I'm a big fan too. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I've learned tons from playing with whiskeys and blending them together, and maturing whiskey on my own. Getting one of those countertop casks that was like a 5 grain. Yeah. He says, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I meant to highlight that question. So so for clarification, which 5 grains are in that 5 grain?
It's an excellent question. It's got the mash bill, and I think I can, if you give me half a second, I can find the samples, and I'm sure.
Yeah, this has got to bake for a minute anyway, so that's a great time to go do some research.
Wow.
That's surprising. It's not. Sometimes when you blend a bunch of different stuff together, it goes flat.
Yeah. Here's the sample bottle. I can even tell you the mash bill, because I think they're all the same, no matter what sample it is. It's 55% corn, 25% wheat, 15% rye, 5% barley.
Okay.
So that's what I'll be bottling next. And I think
you said 5. Sorry, one more time. What's the 5th grain? So we normally have corn, wheat, rye, malted
4
barley.
grain. Sorry, it's 4 grain. Did I say 5 grain? 4 grain.
Okay.
Corn, wheat, rye, barley. Yeah.
Okay.
That's why
we were looking
5 grain. He's like,
we were looking for the mysterious. What's the 5th grain? Is it rice? Triticale?
No, that's me. It's it's getting into my cups, and
you did say dry fly, and dry fly does some interesting grains, including the triticale. So
I would love to. That's what I've got, a fantastic whiskey that they gave me. They sent me a few samples of different stuff that they said would be fun, and it was fun. And it's an 8-year-old. I think it's basically an Irish whiskey mash bill. It's malted and unmalted barley, and it's wonderful. I'm hoping, they said that they don't have any triticale available right now. I'm hoping that this is a foot in the door to be able to bottle a triticale, because when I visited Dry Fly, they rolled out the red carpet, and I got to try some samples from like 8-year-old triticales that had been finished in Washington State red wine. I think it was something similar to Syrah, and good heavens, were those stunning whiskeys. But they weren't on offer this time. And the first time I visited them, the interaction was great. I got home and was emailing them, and they were like, well, our distiller is hesitant and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't want to, I think he thought like their distiller felt like every barrel was his baby, was his child, and didn't want to give any of them up. So I bided my time, bottled this stuff, emailed them again, and that's happened repeatedly. Like my first round, I could not get into Westland. But now that I've got stuff bottled and it's selling and marketed and getting reviewed well, all of a sudden I revisit those distilleries, and they're like, "Oh yes, please come visit, and we can talk."
Yeah, same thing has kind of happened with the podcast too. There's some people who wouldn't respond to somebody who who are you? Why do we care?
Yes.
And I totally understand that, right? No shade. I'm happy that I'm getting the access now. I know that there's
I'm
a
of
process.
this exactly the same persuasion. I completely understand why you wouldn't extend yourself to an unknown quantity, and why you would once somebody has proven that they are a going concern. Yeah. Yeah.
I do have a question. So first of all,
Yeah.
Phil says, I have a new project now, find a 5-grain whiskey.
what,
I am also interested in that. I'll let you run that project, and I will experience
what
the
do you
results.
do? What's the fifth grain going to be? Millet? I've got a millet whiskey.
Sorghum maybe, because we
Sorghum, millet.
certainly know that there's a lot of alcohol made from sorghum.
What's the one? Oh, from Las Vegas Distillery, George, the owner and head distiller of Las Vegas Distillery. He passed away a few years ago, but it's been revived and they're bottling again under new ownership. But he bottled a Kamut whiskey, which was an ancient Egyptian grain that was thought to be gone, and then it was found in some sort of a few grains were found in some were found in some urns in tombs in Egypt, and they were viable, and they grew them and propagated it, and it's a crop now. And
that's how we got the plague. Yeah, okay.
Yes, exactly, something like that. But he
Okay.
bottled the Kamut whiskey, and it's pretty damn good, actually. Yeah. So there are other grains, but there are 4 that are primarily used in whiskey. Yeah.
So, in your experience as a whiskey enthusiast before starting an independent bottling company, did you ever do a single barrel selection? And if you did, what's the difference for you between doing a single barrel selection and doing independent bottling?
No, I never did. This was my first. This was my first experience in cask selection. I had a whole lot of experience with whiskeys of all different sorts, especially Scotch, and did a lot of work writing my own tasting notes and everything, and thought that I might have something as far as a palate and an ability to discern good whiskey from bad, and complex whiskey from flat, uninteresting stuff. So I'd been in the other thing that's close to it is I had been taking multiple trips to Scotland, and most of that involved going to distilleries and going to castle ruins. And the distillery visits, always I went for the upscale tours and tastings, and the best of those ended up in warehouses, and often dunnage warehouses, which means a bare earth floor. The barrels are only stacked 3 high, and there's no better place to drink whiskey than in a warehouse. It just smells fantastic, especially an old warehouse where casks have been leaking into the ground, and it's moldy and spider webby, and that's all the better. So I had plenty of experience drinking single cask whiskeys bottled and drinking single cask whiskeys in warehouses. Lots of experience. But no, I'd never been a part of a liquor store or anything that was doing barrel picks or anything. This is my first go. And the feedback I'm getting just sort of confirms my instincts and my hopes that I had a good palate and would have a good ability to choose good casks.
I think you certainly have. I think this whiskey is ready for a little analysis.
All right.
So I think I would say at least 4 out of 6 of these samples I can taste or smell in this profile.
Exactly. Like the first thing I put probably the least of any of these. I put the least rye into this, and it was the first thing I smelled when I put it to my nose.
That chocolate, that sort of chocolatey and that floral is there. And
Yeah.
I probably put the most Copperworks into this. For some reason, I had the most of that left.
Yep.
And I definitely taste those high, bright pops of citrus there. If from a little distance, you definitely get just a whisper of that mesquite smoke. That's still in there. That's easy,
Yep.
though. It's either smoky or it's not, right?
Yes.
I think the only one I don't particularly pick up is the 2-bar. The bourbon is kind of buried now.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, definitely the rye and the mesquite and the chocolate malted barley. Those are the 3 biggest flavored whiskeys that I've bottled. And
Yeah, speaking of
the Blinking Owl is a really boldly flavored whiskey too, but it blends into all of the other. It's got tasting notes in common with those other big 3, I think.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. It's hard to pick it apart from the rise,
Yeah.
especially because it
Yeah.
has a lot of common tasting notes.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is really nice. This is kind of a nicely balanced blend. I mean, I don't know that I would say this is the blend, let's put it on a shelf, but this turned out really nicely.
Yep, something I hadn't done before.
One thing I was going to say, this set, so as you know, I'm from the Seattle area.
Right.
Well, I grew up in Texas, so I have some context on the mesquite smoke and so on. But I currently am located in the Seattle area, and so of course I know Copperworks, and I actually have never been to 2-bar, even though it's about a 10-minute walk from Westland, which I've been to a whole bunch of times. And I need to fix that. I know I need to fix that.
It's
Jake from Coming Whiskey keeps telling me I'm missing out by not experiencing a lot of 2-bar. And now I have.
They had. I thought they had really great bourbon when I first went there, and this second trip, it's several notches better. It's worth a trip. Make sure you do that. And I think it's less than a 10-minute walk from Westland.
It might be.
Oh, yeah.
It's a 2-minute drive.
Yeah.
You know, it's a short walk is the point.
Nathan Kaiser is fantastic, and the gal who Maddie is his head. She's doing most of the distilling now. I think she had walked in and said, "Will you teach me how to?" She just walked in off the street, I think, from how he tells it, and said, "Will you teach me how to distill?" And he said, "Sure." And she just kept coming back and sticking around. And then he offered her a percentage of the ownership to come on, and she's great. The first time we went there, she was pregnant as could be, ready to pop, and she's throwing around bags of grain and everything, and doing the whole schmear. She's incredible. Yeah, but Nathan,
that's a really common story, that show up and work and eventually you get a job at a distillery.
Yeah. Nathan is a super affable, really likable guy. He's really fun. You should you definitely should pop in. There's no reason not to if you're in the Seattle area. Yeah.
Absolutely will. It's just remembering that that's a thing I could do, really.
Yeah.
Because I focus so heavily on American Single Malt that I do often miss out on obvious non-malt distilleries that I really should visit. So I'm trying to make that adjustment. We used to have, I shouldn't say used to, we regularly have occasionally a guest that doesn't make American Single Malt on some other spirit or another type of whiskey. And you know, while we mostly focus on American Single Malt, we think there's other aspects to the conversation too. And as a production, not paying any attention to those things, I think, is a disservice. So absolutely. Yeah. So Phil says he's had spelt whiskey from Fall Street.
I've had spelt whiskey too from a distillery in Chicago, Koval.
That sounds right.
Yeah, they do a millet and a spelt. Yeah, I've had both of theirs. Yeah, both of them. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say, just as like a wrap up on my experience of going through these 6 samples. So
Yes.
they're all fairly unique from each other. They're all really interesting and very powerful flavors, very good whiskey. The thing that, as you said, Heritage blew your mind again and again. I know Heritage, but I know Heritage Distilling Spirits, Heritage Distilling, yes,
Yes.
um, from their tasting room in Ballard back when they had that open, which I think closed in 2021 or
Hmm.
earlier. Um, and they had the brown sugar bourbon, and they had the flavored whiskeys, and they had the flavored vodkas, and the vodka and the gin and the everything, the whole white spirits and flavored spirits and all this sorts of stuff. That's, they've got a ton of products. Lots of them are flavored. And I won't say that I wrote them off as a distillery, right? I think they're good anyway. I bought a bottle several years later, I bought a bottle of their vodka. It's quality stuff. But I did not suspect that they had 5 and 6-year-old quote unquote serious whiskey.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
your set of samples here told me I've been missing out. There's something
Yeah.
about Heritage I have not been exploring that I should be.
Yep.
And
They,
I'm happy that I've had that experience here.
yeah. They've bottled a bunch of them. What you want to watch for is the upscale line is called Stiefels Select. And
Stiefel Select. Okay.
and I think, and they are bottling a bunch of them. They are, I think, both a little younger than the casks that I've bought, and they are also bottling them at a little lower ABV. Still pretty stout. I think like 48% or something like that. You can look, since you're going to their website, you can look and see. But they are.
I had to figure out how to spell Stiefels. It's Stiefel.
Stiefel. Yeah. Stiefel Select. Yeah. So they've bottled. I think, I don't know if they've bottled the chocolate malted barley yet. I think they might have. I know they had a label ready to be submitted for approval. I'm not sure if they bottled that, but they've definitely bottled the rye and the 4-grain bourbon and some others. But I think they're all bottled a bit younger, like 4 years old or so, and 48%. But I'm sure those are fantastic, and that's right up your alley. That's what you're looking for.
Yeah, sounds great. That right there is the best thing that an independent bottler can do, is to show a consumer a different side of a brand they already know.
Yeah.
And convince them that this brand is worth having a deeper look at. That's my favorite thing with independent bottlers. SMWS, Fisherman's Retreat. Although, I mean, let's be honest, anything that's laddie, the independent bottlers that are bottling extra laddie stuff are like, they've got access and they're getting the good stuff, and you already know that you're going to get the good stuff. But just other like Scotch independent bottlers, the best thing that happens. Why couldn't I think of it? Signatory Vintage, the ultimate, right? These independent bottlers are showing you a side of a distillery that you didn't know was there, right? Through the ultimate, I discovered the Bunnahabhain Staucha formulation, the heavily peated Port Ellen maltings. That is my favorite Isla, and that's hard to get as an OB.
Yeah.
So you've got something that you can be provided uniquely by independent bottlers that brands don't necessarily provide, is showing you these sides that don't necessarily fit into their own product portfolio. And that's just such a cool thing to see.
Yeah, for sure. I bought a bottle. My buddy Michael owns Inverurie Whiskey Shop in Inverurie, which is in Aberdeenshire in northeast Scotland. And I bought a bottle when I was there and it was more than I would have wanted to pay for it. And it was 16-year-old Bunnahabhain. And I only recently opened it, and I was stunned to find that it's peated, pretty strongly peated. It's sherry matured and peated. And I looked around at the back label, and the tasting notes all of a sudden say smoke or campfire barbecue. And I'm like, and it's beautiful. Good Lord. It's a fantastic whiskey. Yeah. Fun. Yep.
All right, I think we've probably tortured the dwindling audience enough. It's probably
All
time
right.
for us to call it a night. It's been really great speaking to you. As always, we really value your time is your most valuable resource, and the fact that you've given us over 2 hours of your time tonight, we really appreciate that. So, what should we toast to?
To Single Malt Frontier. I don't know. To Single
Oh,
Malt School. There.
thank you. Let's say to the discovery of single malts.
There you go. The discovery of
So,
American single malts.
yeah. So to single malts, and until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. Cheers and good night,
All
everybody.
right. Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Good night.